The trouble began on a humid Sunday morning, long before the neighborhood fully woke. The sun had barely climbed over the rooftops when the homeowner, a detail-oriented and generally quiet man named Adrian, received the first email from the HOA. It was written in the usual clipped, officious tone that the board favored, formal, vaguely threatening, and designed to make residents feel as though they were already guilty of something. According to the email, Adrian's brand-new AI-powered doorbell system was producing persistent auditory disturbances that violated community standards. The accusation struck him as absurd. The doorbell had been specifically chosen for its silent, motion-activated features. It didn't chime unless he toggled the app to do so, and even then, the noise level was softer than the hum of a refrigerator. Yet the HOA insisted that multiple complaints had been filed within just 1 week of installation. They demanded an immediate assessment, threatened escalating fines, and reminded him that technology with noise-emitting components must be approved before use. Adrian reread the email several times, searching for logic. None emerged. He lived near the edge of the community, with no shared walls, no nearby walkways, and no history of disputes with neighbors. In fact, the closest property belonged to a retired couple who rarely even came outside. His front porch was practically a vacuum of silence. Still, the HOA had spoken, and when the HOA spoke, trouble tended to follow. He stood at his window, scanning the neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes lined along the street. The neighborhood looked peaceful, typical, even dull. But Adrian knew appearances could be deceiving here. The HOA prided itself on strict rule-keeping, and the board members relished their authority. They walked the sidewalks like patrolling guards, searching for violations, measuring shrub height, checking paint shades, and issuing citations with a speed that bordered on obsessive. He had always kept his head down, paid his dues, and stayed compliant. It seemed that strategy had reached its limit. Later that afternoon, a printed letter arrived in his mailbox. This time the HOA issued a formal fine, $200 for disturbance of neighborhood peace. They provided no timestamp, no evidence, no recordings, only the claim that multiple verified reports confirmed the noise. Adrian felt his patience thinning. He searched his doorbell logs, expecting to find a glitch or miscalibration in the sound detection settings. Everything was normal. The data showed no irregularities, no noise events, nothing remotely resembling the complaints. The situation gnawed at him through the evening. He sat at his desk, scrolling through community forums and archived messages from the HOA. Pattern emerged. Several neighbors had experienced similar issues in the past. Fines for phantom violations, citations without proof, accusations that seemed fabricated. The board wanted control, and the easiest targets were residents who didn't fight back. The only difference now was the technological angle. They knew most people couldn't argue against a claim involving an electronic device. It was the perfect loophole for them. Adrian decided he wouldn't be their next victim. Over the next few days, he observed the neighborhood more carefully than usual. He noticed something odd. The HOA board members, particularly the president, a severe woman known for her rigid enforcement, frequently lingered near his property. Sometimes they strolled past with clipboards. Other times they slowed their pace as if listening for something. They consistently glanced at his doorbell camera, as though expecting it to emit some great, offensive racket. Their behavior felt rehearsed, unnatural, almost like they were staging moments that could later be cited as evidence. It dawned on him that the noise complaint wasn't the point. The doorbell itself was the issue. The HOA hated anything they couldn't fully control, and smart technology represented freedom they didn't oversee. His doorbell was a small piece of independence, something they considered a threat. The next week brought another fine, this one doubled. The HOA claimed continued disturbances. Again, they offered no proof. Adrian spent that night reading through legal documents, community bylaws, and state regulations around audio surveillance and residential privacy. If the HOA was going to push him, he intended to push back harder. Late into the night, an idea surfaced, one that grew more compelling the longer he examined it. His current doorbell model already offered high-resolution recording, motion detection, and historical data storage. But he knew of another system, a more advanced version rarely used in residential settings. It had superior sensors, a wider field of view, and logging capabilities far beyond what the HOA could anticipate. It could capture movement from farther away, identify recurring visitors, and timestamp their every pass. It could track not just audible events but visual patterns too. If the HOA claimed his doorbell was noisy, then he would give them something entirely different. Undeniable proof of what they were actually doing. The idea hardened into determination. He ordered the advanced system, choosing overnight delivery. When it arrived, he spent hours installing it with meticulous precision. The new device was sleek, discreet, powerful. It blended seamlessly into the exterior of his home, looking nearly identical to the old unit, something the HOA would never notice unless they studied it closely. What they would notice, however, were the consequences. On the first evening after installation, the doorbell's expanded motion logs lit up with unexpected activity. At nearly midnight, two individuals, both familiar silhouettes, approached his property. They were board members, flashlights in hand, whispering as they examined his front porch. They came close enough that the camera captured their ID badges. One of them tapped on his doorbell, muttering disapproval. Another jotted notes on a clipboard, marking something down. They stayed for several minutes before quietly retreating down the walkway. Adrian watched the footage with a growing sense of fury. The HOA claimed his device was producing noise, yet it was they who were creeping around in the dark, tapping on the lens, disturbing the peace they pretended to protect. And the upgraded system didn't just capture their presence. It recorded their timestamps, approaches, gestures, and behaviors with clinical clarity. Over the next several nights, the same pattern repeated. HOA members visited at odd hours, not just late at night but before dawn, circling his property like vultures hunting for violations. They never knocked. They never announced themselves. They simply snooped, assessed, and left. The upgraded doorbell tracked everything. By the time Adrian compiled the recordings, he had amassed enough evidence to challenge every accusation they had made against him. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA had tried to accuse his silent doorbell of excessive noise, and in doing so, had walked straight into the field of view of a device far more capable than they realized. Now it was just a matter of timing. He needed the right moment to confront them. Not impulsively, not in anger, but strategically. The board had a scheduled meeting coming up, one that allowed residents to present concerns. It would be the perfect stage. And as the night before the meeting arrived, the doorbell captured something even more damning. Something that would shift the conflict from petty harassment into a full-scale HOA scandal. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived with a heavy stillness hanging over the neighborhood. It was the kind of quiet that seemed artificial, as though the very houses were holding their breath. Adrian felt it the moment he stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky unblemished, and the street unusually empty for that hour. Residents often walked their dogs early, but today, not a single person was in sight. It was as though word had already spread that something was brewing, something the HOA board would prefer to keep buried. The previous night's recordings had unsettled even him. At 2:17 a.m., the upgraded doorbell captured the HOA president and two board members returning to his property for another late-night inspection. But this time, they took it further. One crouched beside his electrical box, shining a flashlight inside while the others whispered urgently. The president paced back and forth, glancing up at his windows as though expecting to be watched. Eventually, one of the board members attempted to tug at the siding near the doorbell, as if testing how firmly it was attached. The signs were subtle, but unmistakable. They weren't just inspecting. They were probing, searching for something they could twist into a violation. What they found instead was a perfectly functioning system silently documenting their every move. Adrian saved the footage into a secure folder, labeling each clip with timestamps, member names, and additional notes. The database now spanned nearly 2 weeks of harassment. Midnight visits, pre-dawn prowling, whispered conversations about finding evidence, and moments where board members tested boundaries that no HOA regulation allowed. His frustration had evolved into a cold, steady resolve. They had overstepped, and today they would be confronted with their own behavior, displayed as plainly as the rules they claimed to uphold. The meeting hall was located in the community clubhouse, a polished, overly air-conditioned space designed to look more sophisticated than it truly was. The walls were lined with framed photos of past HOA presidents, each wearing a forced smile. A long table sat at the front where the current board members arranged themselves in stiff formation. As residents filtered in, murmurs filled the room. Most sat politely, unaware of the storm about to be unleashed. Others glanced at the board members with the cautious obedience typical of HOA meetings. People had learned that pushing back too hard often resulted in mysteriously increased fines or sudden re-inspections of their properties. Adrian took a seat in the second row, laptop in hand, his expression calm but unreadable. When the meeting finally began, the HOA president launched into the agenda with her usual theatrical authority, reviewing landscaping compliance, announcing upcoming paint audits, and reminding everyone about trash can visibility rules. Her tone was clipped and controlled, betraying none of the tension brewing behind her stern facade. Then came the line item he had been waiting for. Resident concerns and appeals. The room shifted. People turned their heads toward him. Everyone knew he was the one fighting the latest string of HOA penalties. Gossip traveled quickly here. When he stood, the board members stiffened almost imperceptibly. The president folded her hands, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if bracing for an argument she believed she could easily dominate. Adrian approached the podium without speaking. The silence stretched as he opened his laptop and connected it to the projector cable. The screen behind the board flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the tense room. He navigated through folders with deliberate slowness, his actions controlled and unhurried. The board president shifted uncomfortably, watching him with growing unease. He selected the first video. It began with a still shot of his front porch at midnight. The enhanced night vision lens rendered the footage crisp and unmistakable. Moments later, the HOA vice president appeared on screen, stepping into view with a flashlight. He tapped on the doorbell, 3 sharp, audible clicks, and bent forward to inspect it while muttering to someone off camera. The room fell silent. The sound echoed faintly through the speakers, contradicting every claim that the doorbell was the one creating noise. He let the video play in full before moving to the next. This time, 2 board members approached. One scrawled notes on a clipboard at 3 in the morning, while the other adjusted a shrub on Adrian's property without permission. Their whispers were picked up, quiet discussions of needing something solid, and anything that breaks compliance. Each clip painted the same narrative: harassment, trespassing, and deliberate attempts to manufacture violations. There were recordings of them walking through his yard, shining lights directly into his windows, and pacing his driveway long before dawn. Layer upon layer of evidence accumulated, each more incriminating than the last. The room had grown so quiet that even the low hum of the air conditioner felt intrusive. The HOA president's once composed posture had deteriorated. Her jaw tightened, her fingers dug into the polished wood of the table. Yet she remained silent, likely calculating the least damaging response. Adrian advanced to the final clip, the one from the night before. It showed the president herself crouched by his electrical box, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. She opened the panel and examined the wiring. After a moment, she gestured to another board member behind her and whispered instructions that hinted at altering something if they found a loophole. The action was unmistakably unauthorized tampering. A soft gasp rippled through the audience. Even residents who rarely challenged the HOA shifted in their seats, whispering to each other in disbelief. Adrian paused the video and let the frozen image hang on the screen. No explanation was needed. The recording spoke for itself. The board had violated multiple community regulations, trespassed on private property, attempted to tamper with electrical equipment, and fabricated evidence to justify their fines. He stepped back from the podium without a word. The silence that followed was suffocating. Residents stared at the board with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and fear. The president finally rose, her face pale but determined to salvage authority. She attempted to dismiss the recordings as taken out of context. But the excuse fell flat in the face of such explicit documentation. Some residents openly scoffed. Others shook their heads. The vice president leaned in to whisper something to her, but even that was met with narrowed eyes from the crowd. The trust they once wielded so confidently had evaporated. As tensions escalated and voices began to rise. The HOA president abruptly announced the end of the meeting, claiming the board needed to review the material internally. She fled from the table before anyone could object, her exit swift and unceremonious. The rest of the board followed, avoiding eye contact with the residents who now viewed them not as enforcers, but as manipulators caught in their own web. Adrian closed his laptop and walked out of the clubhouse with measured calm. Behind him, the residents were still buzzing, angry, confused, emboldened. Something fundamental had shifted in the community. The HOA's power, once unquestioned, had been punctured. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he sensed that the conflict was far from over. Evidence alone didn't dismantle an HOA. The board still held influence, and cornered authority rarely surrendered quietly. He had exposed their actions. Now he would discover how they planned to retaliate. In the days following the meeting, the neighborhood underwent a transformation that felt almost physical, as if the tightly wound threads of anxiety that had long held the community in place were finally snapping. Normally, the streets carried a kind of stifling politeness, a rehearsed calm sustained by unspoken pressure. But now people lingered on sidewalks. They talked openly in driveways. They compared notes, shared stories, and admitted, for the first time aloud, that they had long feared the HOA board. It was as though Adrian's recordings had not merely exposed wrongdoing. They had broken a collective silence. By the third day, whispers had grown into deep conversations. Stories poured out. A forced repainting that cost a family thousands. A mysteriously lost appeal that residents suspected was never even reviewed. Accusations about backyard playsets, flags, garden gnomes. Tiny grievances weaponized into control. People had endured these things in isolation, assuming they were alone in being targeted. Now they understood the truth. The board thrived on intimidation, keeping the neighborhood obedient through fear of fines and retaliation. The board, however, reacted very differently. The president attempted to reassert control immediately after the meeting, sending out a long, rambling email to the entire community. She claimed the recordings were misleading, that the late-night visits were part of routine compliance checks, and that tampering with the electrical panel was standard safety protocol. The message reeked of desperation. The excuses were implausible even to those who had supported her in the past. For the first time in years, the authority of the HOA board was openly questioned. Residents responded not with compliance, but with demands. Dozens requested an emergency vote for leadership removal. Others insisted the board release financial records, which had never been made fully transparent. Several residents, emboldened by Adrian's courage, filed formal complaints with the city about trespassing, misuse of HOA authority, and evidence tampering. A few even hinted at possible legal action. The board had lost the narrative, and those who once governed with icy confidence now wavered under scrutiny. Adrian watched all of this unfold with cautious detachment. He hadn't intended to spark a rebellion. He simply wanted to protect himself from unjust fines. But the recordings had become more than personal evidence. They had become a catalyst for collective change. People approached him regularly now, thanking him for exposing what they had feared to confront. Some even asked for help installing their own upgraded security systems, wanting the same safeguard that had protected him. Yet amid the growing sense of empowerment in the community, a subtle tension lingered. Adrian sensed that the HOA president had not yet accepted defeat. He noticed her SUV circling the neighborhood more often. He caught sight of the vice president at odd hours, slipping between houses as though searching for something. Perhaps leverage, perhaps escape, perhaps another attempt to regain control. The breakthrough came exactly 1 week after the meeting. That morning, Adrian discovered another email from the HOA, this one sent to him privately rather than to the entire community. It was curt, stripped of the usual formal flourishes, and wore the sharp edge of anger disguised as professionalism. The board demanded that he surrender all original recordings for internal review and refrain from circulating them further. They warned him that failure to comply could result in legal repercussions. Adrian read the message twice, feeling a cold certainty settle over him. The threat was empty, desperate. They wanted the recordings only to bury them. And they had made a critical mistake. He had already shared the files with several neighbors, as well as backed them up in multiple online locations. Erasing them was impossible. Still, the email confirmed his suspicion that the board was not simply retreating. They were scrambling. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the upgraded doorbell captured one more piece of footage. A single figure approached stealthily, hood pulled low, moving with the rigid unease of someone attempting to avoid detection. The figure knelt at the edge of Adrian's porch, reaching again for the electrical panel. But this time, the attempt was clumsier, tinged with frantic energy rather than cautious scheming. The camera captured everything: the silhouette, the posture, the distinctive purse strap that the HOA president always carried. She fled moments later, startled by the porch light that activated automatically. The footage was damning, not only because it showed clear trespassing, but because it demonstrated intent to interfere with Adrian's property even after the board had been publicly exposed. He downloaded the clip, labeled it, and sent it anonymously to the emergency meeting organizers the next morning. That was the final blow. Within 48 hours, the HOA membership held an unprecedented vote. Turnout was the highest the community had ever seen. The results were decisive. The president, vice president, and 2 other board members were removed immediately. Interim replacements were appointed, residents known for fairness and level-headedness rather than control. The newly appointed leadership released a transparent financial summary, revealing mismanaged funds, unexplained expenses, and dubious administrative fees approved solely by the former board members. The neighborhood reacted with a mixture of shock and relief. For years, the HOA had been weaponized to enforce the whims of a small group of individuals. Now, for the first time, people felt hopeful. They held impromptu gatherings, discussed changes, and drafted proposals for updated, resident-friendly bylaws. The community had shifted from a quiet dictatorship into something resembling genuine cooperation. As for Adrian, he found himself receiving more gratitude than he was comfortable accepting. Neighbors brought baked goods, handwritten letters, and small tokens of appreciation. Some simply stood on his lawn and thanked him for giving them courage. He accepted their kindness politely, though he never felt like a hero. He was simply someone who refused to be bullied. One late afternoon, standing on his porch with the cool breeze brushing past, he looked at the upgraded doorbell, the small piece of technology that had turned his life upside down. What had begun as a nuisance fine had evolved into a total dismantling of corrupt authority. He tapped the device lightly, appreciating its silent presence. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA had claimed it was noisy, disruptive, an unacceptable threat to neighborhood peace. But the real disturbance had always been them: the late-night prowling, the secret inspections, the silent trespassing dressed up as compliance. In the end, the doorbell had been the quietest thing on his property, and the recordings it captured had spoken louder than any complaint ever could. With the board dismantled, the neighborhood calmer, and the threats evaporated like morning fog, Adrian finally stepped back into his home feeling something he hadn't known since moving there: peace. The kind that didn't come from silence, but from justice finally settling where it belonged.